So welcome to today's session. Today we're here with Citadel. We're going to be going through and kind of walking through the game economy health verification process that the team of Citadel have been through to make sure that the game economy is going to be rock solid. My name's Matthew. I'm the evangelist for Machinations, and I've been working alongside the infamous Cesar. Cesar, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone, my name is Cesar. I am a Machinations diagram architect and I have been working with the Citadel in validating their game economy.
Hey guys, I think everyone knows who I am, but I am Fleet Commander for the time being until docs, but founder of the project alongside Architect and Heimdall and Flamesant. I think you all know my role is just kind of a Mr. Everything, so.
Perfect. The architect?
Hi everyone, I'm the architect. I mostly work on the development side of the Citadel, just making sure everything scales and everything works nicely.
Perfect. And Heimdall?
Hi guys, I'm Heimdall. I handle obviously the economics and balancing the mechanics and token generation and all that sort of stuff.
Perfect. So as I said, please do keep the questions coming. We're going to walk you through the bit about Machinations, a bit of background on it, just so that you can kind of get some context for what we're going to be talking about. Then I'm going to hand over to Cesar to walk through the process that the Citadel's been through to get the verified by Machinations seal. So for those of you that haven't seen this before, this is Machinations. Machinations has been around for quite a while. It's used by over 35,000 game designers to visualize and start testing game mechanics. It's made up of these 11 objects down the left-hand side. Let's just quickly talk about the challenge that teams face when they're building out a Web3 project. The very core essence of what's going on here, you're going to play the game, you're going to collect some ore. Once that ore's been collected, you'll then level up ships and you'll increase your ship level, which will help you collect more ore. Now, obviously, these numbers aren't real, but it's just a way of kind of visualizing what's going on. With Web3 games and with all kind of blockchain games, there's this additional option, which is now to sell that ore to exchange it via the blockchain. The challenge that the Citadel team face is there's not just one of these loops going on at the same time. Each player is going to go through their already complex progression systems. They're going to have different play styles, going to take different amounts of risks. There's miners, there's marauders. In the old days of Web 2, all of these progression systems would still be isolated, but now they're all linked together through the marketplaces and through the token exchanges. This means that certain actions that take place could impact all of the players, and it's all now linked to a single overall economy. Add into that fluctuations in cryptocurrency values, and it suddenly becomes a really complex economy for anyone to be able to understand. And this is where Machinations comes in as the world-leading platform for game economies and game design. Let me jump to my next model. Say I'm normally based out of the UK, as you can probably tell from my accent, but I'm in sunny San Francisco this week for the Game Developer Conference. Now, the initial process that the team at Citadel have been through is we came to an agreement. We then went through a kickoff call process, and during that step, we went through and built out some core models that showed the very essence of what all the core game mechanics were within the Citadel. Once we've been through that, we then built out single player models that allowed us to test and simulate how individual players would experience the Citadel, what their impact on the economy would be, how quickly they would collect ore, the different regions, and how all those different mechanics that you've seen in the white paper, how they actually come together to simulate the player economy. Once we've been through that, we then we started building out different types of player logic. Big focus on this, and I won't steal Cesar's thunder, but looking at how we would then simulate different types of ship classes, how they would then experience the overall economy and the game mechanics. Then we go through and we build out a full macro economy where we start to look at the maximum number of players that there can be in the economy, how you're all likely to interact with it, and start building up simulations that allow us to test and understand what's likely to happen in the full macro economy. Then we go through and we really put the economy through the tests, where we've made sure that kind of no matter what happens, the game economy's got the potential to be sustainable and can always be able to kind of, looking at different types of launch scenarios, see what the outcome would be. And we really want to see that it's not about predicting the future, it's about making sure that the Citadel team are ready for having a great experience. Now we've reached that stage, we've completed that, and now we've just issued the seal of approval to say that the Citadel team have been through this process and do have a sustainable game economy. Where we're going to go to next is we then start to ingest player analytics data back into Machinations. And once we've done that, we will rerun those forecasts, rerun those simulations to make sure that everything is constantly sustainable. Let me just, one moment. Sorry, there was somebody spamming chat a lot, so I just removed them. So this means that as we move forward, Machinations are able to further analyze the data, take all those assumptions that we make at the moment, and we've called those out to make sure we're clear what all those assumptions are. Once the game goes live, we then use real player data to validate those assumptions and then ensure that we're constantly on a weekly basis rerunning our forecasts to make sure we've got a nice sustainable economy. As I'm sure all games do, the game will evolve and it'll change over time. Every time there's going to be an update, we go through and we test those in Machinations first to make sure they're not going to have a detrimental impact on the overall economy, and that we can then ensure that it keeps on being sustainable. Then the last section is, because we're constantly looking at the economy on a weekly basis, if we do start to see any issues of inflation or deflation impacting the economy, we'll then raise an alert to the team and go through and test to see what small changes we can make to rebalance the economy to make sure it remains sustainable. So I'm now going to hand over to Cesar to walk us through in a little bit more detail the process that the Citadel team have been through.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. You can see my screen, right? I would hate to be talking and okay. So everyone, I'm just going to talk about the process that we've been through, how we've approached it, what conclusions we came to. I already saw someone in the chat earlier asking for a Marauder nerf, so don't worry, we went through that already. So it's something that we went back and forth with. So we made sure that Marauders are a bit more fair compared to miners. There's not such a big difference between them. And yeah, so as Matthew showed you in his model earlier, we have some steps in our process. The first step was the introductory call, where Matthew has this special talent of his where he can build models while people just talk about their game mechanics. That is in essence a smaller model where we just try to capture the game's core mechanics. So as he kind of showed you earlier, the core was that players gather ore and get to invest their ore into, gathering more ore over time, whether it being upgrades, purchasing new ships. So that's the core loop of the game. Now, what we do after that, after the initial call, is we go and try to model the game's mechanics entirely from a single player perspective. So we want to look at, if a player logs into the game, what will they be able to do? How can they interact with the game? What results will that player have over a prolonged period of time? And this is what we are seeing here. I'm not going to zoom in. I'm not going to go very into detail. I'm just going to explain in general what's going on. What I have in the model here is basically a player. They're going to be assigned a ship. Ships can have different sizes, and players can have different play styles, right? There will be players that log in, I don't know, once a day. There will be players that log in once every 3 days. There will be players that log in once every hour. Players that will take play it safe, players that will play more risky. So there's a lot of different play styles here. What I'm doing here is looking at different players, looking at different play styles, looking at different ships, and essentially looking at how over time those players are able to gather ore, right? How many tokens they are burning, how many tokens they are gathering, and seeing that there are no large discrepancies between, let's say, different ship types, let's say miners and marauders, right? So for instance, when we first started with this model, when I first built this, one of my first the first thing that I discovered is that the gap between miners and marauders is pretty large, right? So we went in, we discussed what we should do about it, and we came with some solutions there and brought them closer together, both miners and marauders. We also discussed on fuel costs. We discussed on the difference between ship sizes, right? What are the advantages and disadvantages? So we went through all these and adjusted things such as belt capacity, things such as ship speed. So things like this, we went back and forth and until we were satisfied with the results. After finishing with the single player model and looking at all of the data that we get from that from a single player perspective and seeing, okay, the ships are in a good place, the regions are in a good place, the belts are in a good place, everything is looking okay. Obviously, it's very hard to predict exactly, right? Because you have a player, you assume that they will play actively, right? You assume that they favor higher risk, higher reward regions, but they're not always going to do that, right? I don't know. Maybe you're the type of player to play nonstop, but some weekend, I don't know, you're out of town and you're not going to play in that weekend. Like there are cases like this that are impossible to predict. Players will have different days, different play styles. So what we're looking at is a general approach of, okay, a player can probably earn between X and Y tokens in a day. If that's fine, that's great. But again, it's not like a given. The conclusions that I came to is that what you will be doing in the game is very important in generating tokens. After we were done with the single player model, I had basically a sheet where I had data on different players, where different ships with different playstyles, and I could see kind of how much tokens they are able to generate per day. What I did with that data is I moved to my second model, which is the full economy model. The full economy model is a model where I don't look at individual players going through the game. I look at the entire server. So every player, every ship that is owned, and the amount of tokens that those ships are able to generate, the amount of tokens that those ships are burning, the amount of tokens that they are able to spend on auctions, that they are willing to spend on auctions. So basically what I'm looking at is in different scenarios with different cases of players with different, let's say, scenarios, what's the best outcome, what's the worst outcome, what's the most likely outcome, things like this. And our mission here was to make sure that even if in the worst scenarios that we can imagine, the economy is still sustainable over time. So even if, I wouldn't say like what dark scenarios are, but even in those dark scenarios, it is still profitable for players to engage with the game. What I'm doing in here is basically, again, not going to go very into details. You'll probably notice on the right here, I have some layers which are hidden. That's the math behind it. I'm not going to show that. This model is a lot fatter in reality. Like this, you're basically seeing a skeleton here. But what I'm doing is I'm taking data from the single player, and I'm moving that to the full economy. So if I know, for instance, that a player that owns a small ship that hangs around region 1, let's just give an example, earns, let's say, 10 ore per day, just to give a number. I can then go in here and say, okay, my players that own light ships and go into region 1 will own between 7 to 13 ore per day with some variation, right? And by doing that, I can easily track all of the ships, all of the activities that the ships do in the ecosystem, how much ore they generate, right? And how much each of these is gaining. And I am putting that everything into a single, let's call it player owned tokens, right? I am looking at how, so for instance, let me just show this a bit just to show on the right in the chart here. On the right here, where you see nodes, there are data points that I'm tracking for the full economy model. You can see that I'm tracking how much the miners are capable to mine. What's the treasury looking like? What's the number of burn ships? What's the average level of ship upgrades? And I have a lot of these in here, so you can see that there's a lot of different data points that we can look at in the full economy model. And what I'm doing basically, I'm simulating different types of scenarios that we have and seeing how it affects the ore token price, seeing how it affects the ship price in the auctions, seeing how it affects the amount of ore that players are able to generate, right? The amount of ore that players burn, and things like this. So you can see in the right here where I have my play history, I've done a lot of simulations we can see over here. Some of them I was even smart enough to actually give names. So I have some scenarios in here. So for instance, what if 20% of players sell tokens? What if 90% of players sell tokens, right? What if the ship has a low price? What if the ship has a high price? So scenarios like this, we have a lot of them in here, and we tested through all of them. And we wanted to make sure that through all of these, the economy is sustainable. Obviously, in some cases, the economy is going to be healthier than in other cases. That goes without saying. But of course, it is our objective that each of these at least reaches an equilibrium point over time. What I wanted to do now is show everyone just a couple of charts. I won't be showing, I'll be showing like 3, 4, 5 charts with some data points just to have an idea of what's going on. Now, disclaimer, before I show the charts, everything that we're going to see in here, like 90% of it, is going to have a very zigzag pattern. That's because one important thing to mention here is in the model that I made, the equivalent, you're going to notice that Machinations runs in steps. You can see that I have a step counter here, and it is our job to abstract what a step means. In my case, a step means a real life day. So basically, whenever I run a step in here, it's the same as simulating one day in the Citadel economy. Because ships are on auctions are on a weekly basis, you're going to notice a zigzag pattern. That's because of when the auction is approaching, the values are rising. After the auction is over, the values are going down, and that's a repeating process that goes over time. So that's the zigzag pattern that we're going to notice. First thing that I'm going to show is probably going to be the total player ore. Total player ore essentially means the ore that players own at any given time, the total number of players on the server, the amount of ore that is owned by them. And if we have a look at the standard case scenario, as I said, the zigzag pattern, but we can notice that over time, the curve is decaying, right? So it's not like a constant line. It's generally decaying over time. Players, of course, you can see that the bottom here tends to go upwards. That's because over time, more ships enter the ecosystem, upgrades come in, right? So players are able to mine ore more efficiently. So the general player capability of creating ore is increased over time, which is why the minimum goes up constantly. The maximum does not follow a linear pattern. That's because of a bunch of different factors, which I won't discuss, but generally this is how I'm looking at ore emission. What would have been a bad sign here, for instance, just to give some context, if is instead of having the kind of rainbow shape that it had right now, it was actually inverted, right? If it went if it went more vertical over time. That would have been a bad sign, for instance, a sign for inflation. This is a sign of deflation, which is a very good sign from an economic perspective. I also, since we're on the standard scenario, I can also track a bunch of, I'm also, for instance, tracking, let's say, the amount of burned ships and looking at the amount of ships that are in circulation. So looking at the two, we can see that because of the nature of auctions, limited number of ships that come with auctions, and the ships that do get burned over time due to players taking risks and being unlucky, we can see that the amount of ships generated over time are decreasing. It's a decreasing curve, while the amount of burned ships are increasing. At some point, those two lines start running in parallel, right? So on a weekly basis, you're gonna have about 300 minted ships and about 300 burned ships on average. That's the point of equilibrium where likely the number of ships in the ecosystem won't increase any further, except by very small variations, of course, because again, it's a player-driven game. So it's hard to be very accurate about it. So again, another good sign, the number of ships reaches balance at a point. It's not like over time, if we give the game enough time, there will be an infinite amount of ships. That's very, very unlikely to happen. And something else that I wanted to show, I think, was the favorite ones for the team. The two scenarios with 20%, 90%, I'm gonna show you our ore price per ship, which is gonna be a heavy zigzag. And I'm gonna show you, let me hide the ships first. It's hard to find anything in this mess. I wish I had some sort of
metrics.
Yeah, I wish I had some sort of order when I placed this, but like it was just chaotic. So this is a scenario where only 20% of players choose to sell the token on a daily basis, right? The so-called workers. We can see that the ship ore price, it's increasing over time. This is the effect that I'm actually going to bring another data point here. This is the effect of an ever-increasing ore treasury, right? So we can see that as the treasury generally increases over time, it is expected that ships follow the trend. We also have scenarios that cover this. I'm going to show one later where it's not really necessary that this will be the case. And the token is increasing as well along with the ships, because as new ships come in and the demand for ships is higher, obviously the ore token is more valued. The amount of ore that players generate is cannot keep up with the demand that is needed for new ships. So ore in general should become more valuable as time goes on and new ships come out. The other scenario that I wanted to show was the 90% player sell, which may look pretty bad, but as you can see, it's not that awful. Now, in this scenario, the ship price will not have such a high curve, for instance, like if less players sell. They do have an increasing price over time, and ore still follows the pattern of becoming more valuable over time. So because a lot of players sell, there's not going to be a lot who buy, but those that buy will still, the auctions will still be competitive between those that buy. And because a lot of players sell again, and there's a chance that few players participate in the auction, actually, even those players that sell might stop at some point and consider joining an auction because it looks to them like it's less competitive. So there's some factors to look at here. But again, it's still an increasing scenario. One of the worst, let's call them scenario that we have is one where the price of the ship does not increase over time. So in here, I just put a simple rule. If the ship price is X at the beginning, it's going to be X throughout the whole period of the game. One important thing that I think I forgot to mention at the beginning is that these simulations run for about 550 steps, which equals to about 1.5 years in real time. So in this scenario where the ship price is constant, we can see what's happening to the ore price. The demand is high at the beginning because it's still the beginning of the game's life cycle. Players are still not able to generate enough ore. For the first couple of auctions, there is still a high demand for ore. Then when the new ships come in, there are more ships in the ecosystem, players are able to generate more ore. So over time, players kind of reach a sort of a self-sustaining point, that's when the ore price starts to drop a bit. But we can see that over time, as the curves between the burn ships and the newly minted ships reaches equilibrium, so does the ore token. So we can see that the curve becomes constant towards the end, which is at the same level as the initial price. So it only has this bump at the beginning where there's demand, and it starts trending downwards when players become more self-sustainable. But again, this is basically the darkest scenario that we simulated, and still the fact that the price just doesn't plummet into the ground, right? It reaches equilibrium. That's a very, very good sign for the game economy's health. And I believe this was the most, let's say, I think this was the chart that the team was happiest about, myself included. I think this is a very good sign. I'm not sure if there's anything else I want to show. I just wanted to talk about the process. We're past the process of validating this, so now
We've got loads of questions in the Q&A, Cesar. They've been stacking up. I didn't want to interrupt you.
Yeah.
But maybe we'll switch over to some of those.
Yeah.
The first one is, how frequently will the economic updates be? Is it going to be on a weekly, daily, or like a live oracle? So the way in which Machinations run is we ingest player data once a week, and then we rerun our forecasts to look at the health of the overall economy. We're working very closely with the Citadel team to further automate that process. In the future, it'll be fully automated, and we'll ingest that player analytics data directly into the Machinations models via APIs. So it'll be somewhat like a live oracle in the future, but that's in the future, not quite yet. Cesar, one of the great questions here: how did you map different player types, as in once a day, multiple times a day, things like that?
So essentially, I'm gonna just I have what you see in here. Basically, I'm gonna highlight these are different regions, right? These are the different regions that you have in the game, the 5 ones. And my player has chances of selecting them. Based on their player persona, players can, I don't know, if I want to say that my player is going to be a passive player, they're going to hang around region 1, they're going to log in every 2 days. I'm just going to put a 100% chance of them selecting region 1, and they're only going to travel every 3 days, they're going to do the appropriate. So basically, a player can do everything that's available, let's say, to a player in the model. How I'm differentiating between them is that I am having players selecting certain paths in my model, right? So this model is basically your all-around player. I have, like, those are miners on the left, and I have marauders on the right. From the start, I'm choosing either a miner or a marauder ship. So half of this becomes useless unless I'm doing multiple ships. After that, when I'm selecting how active a player is, again, parts of this become useless. If I'm saying, okay, a player is inactive, they're probably not going to hang around region 4. So they're never going to pick that. That becomes like not used in the model. But when I come later and say, okay, this player is active, then they're going to hang around region 4 a lot, right? So I'm probably not going to be using region 1 too much. So details like this. It's basically the player personas come into which path does my player choose to follow in the model. That's what it comes down to.
Maybe this is one for Heimdall. Did I get the point that there is not the most profitable way? I think there's a couple of people, like, you think some players will come up with the optimal game theory?
Do I think people will come up with the optimal game theory?
Yeah, like how are people going to min-max the economy, do you think?
I think personally the way that we've all designed the game is that it's going to be very difficult to min-max, because technically it's just based on your player positioning and where the other players are around you. So definitely there's better strategies than others, but it's also up to a little bit of randomness and what your choices are and what the other players are choosing around you. Because for example, like, there's real player distance, so the map is 24 hours on average across. If a belt doesn't spawn right next to you, and you're just getting done at another belt, you're going to be losing some time versus other players, you know, just to get to a belt that might be further away or something like that. Or it may not be very high in ore capacity. So it's really up to a lot of, I mean, there is some player skill involved, definitely. And I think some optimal strategies will evolve over time, but I think it's going to be difficult to min-max for sure.
I also want to add something there. If someone were to min-max and 5 other players were to min-max, they would all screw each other. That's like, it's really hard to do. It does require some degree of luck. So.
Great question here. Have you considered the impact, if any, of imbalance in demand for one class, miner or marauder, over the other?
I can try. Yeah, we've definitely considered the impact regarding, you know, class balance and overall, you know, ensuring that there isn't an ideal best class for every type of player, for every persona. And we more try to balance it around, there is a best class based on what type of player persona you are. If you are a more passive player, you are more likely to want a more powerful but slower ship that isn't making as many plays per day. If you have the time to be a more active player persona, you would likely want a quicker ship that is maybe not as powerful mining wise, but speed and fuel efficiency definitely, you know, excelling in those areas. And so the balance has kind of come down to ensuring that every type of class of ship in the game has unique types of player personas, which I think Cesar talked about earlier in the models, how we want to create those personas, and ensuring that, you know, no one of them is particularly better than the other. It's more about how you use them. And I would expect that people probably will find new ways to use certain classes and new types of strategies or patterns as they learn more about the game, and things that we can't, you know, predict right now, which is part of the fun of any game.
That's great. So there's a question here. Ficavada noted the DAO proposal must pass the Machinations audit. Do we know what criteria they're looking at to consider a pass? Curious the range of acceptable impacts on the economy. So I think I'll make a comment on that, and then I'll pass that one over to Cesar. I think the key part of the Machinations process is that Machinations isn't about having an opinions or saying, yes, we're better game designers or better game economy designers than anybody else. The team at Citadel are incredibly talented and you know, have done a fantastic job to come up with the game mechanics for the experience. What Machinations do is it's all about data. So it's not about us saying we think this is good or bad. It's more about us running the simulations to look at the impact and generating data in a safe way, you know, without having to risk players' wallets to generate that data for us. So my perspective on that is it's not so much is there a pass-fail criteria. It's about going, okay, these are the changes that are going to be made. What impact are they going to have on the economy? Let's have a look at the data and see what the data says about it. Now, as long as those changes don't horrifically break the economy and it's going to cause a massive inflation or deflation on the values, like those changes will always pass. But it's about having that safeguard to make sure that you can make those changes confident that they're not going to do something that's going to horrifically break the overall economy. Cesar, is there anything you'd add to that?
No, I think you iterated on. So Matthew's point to us being agnostic is totally correct, right? We're not here to tell anyone you should do this, you should do that, this is better, that is better. We are here to run scenarios, see that your game economy against a lot of different cases is sustainable, right? So that's our only mission. We're not here to make suggestions. We're not here to change anyone's game, right? We're just here to tell you that, okay, if players play your game and they play constantly, nothing bad is going to happen to the economy. We're not going to have a second axis, basically. So
perfect. There's another question here. What if the player predictions did not go as planned? So I think the key thing here is we're not trying to perfectly predict and pretend we've got a crystal ball to say we know what's going to happen with the game economy or we know where the values are going to go. The machinations process is more about, and you saw the list of different scenarios that Cesar put the Citadel, the game economy, through, which is to look at not every, but as many different scenarios as we could think about, and seeing how the game economy was impacted by those. Is there anything you'd add to that,
Yeah,
Cesar?
certainly when the live ops kick in, the live ops process kicks in, data will be much more accurate. So we will have a much more accurate understanding. Until then, we test different scenarios, see that none of them goes bad. Once live data is in, we can look at actual scenarios, which is probably going to be between the range of what we already tested. So
A couple of questions that I've seen around how can you kind of collaborate with your friends in the game. Heimdall, League Commander, what are your thoughts on that? I've seen a couple of questions about kind of guilds or teams collaborating in the game. Have you thought about those mechanics?
Yeah. At the moment, there is no inherent, mechanic with the game, meaning like, you can queue up in a fleet together to play things and, have an impact on your play style directly, via some in-game panel, things like that. Though, obviously, since the actions of other players impact and have a, variable effect on what you're doing, it is likely that in some capacity players will group up together or with their friends or maybe form guilds to somehow figure out maybe strategies and how they rotate around the map together or what they do. But at the moment, there are no mechanics in the game that, explicitly give that any bonus. So it'd just be an auxiliary plan. In the future, though, definitely, have ideas around player corporations and maybe player-owned structures and things like that in a more expansive kind of cooperation thing. Though as well, decentralized project, if you want to build it, you're more than welcome and submit it to the DAO. But if no one beats us to it, we will likely build it at some point.
I will say, possibly for players who maybe know each other in real life or who are really good friends online, in order to win the auction, they might pool their org together, just to be sure that they can win. Something like that might happen. Also, players might go to similar regions because we will have region-based voice chat. So if people are wanting to be more active players, they might go to region 4 and hang out all day in the voice chat together that other people won't have access to. So something like that.
There's a great question here, maybe back to you, Cesar. With the economic balance, will the economic balance be adjusted once PvP mechanics come into place, or have the current economic simulations taken into account a future change in the fundamentals of the game? So I guess that's kind of talking about the change control process.
yeah, change control process. So we're obviously going to be reiterating the models whenever a change occurs. Now, it will always depend on what's the, let's say, gravity of the change. So if it's a smaller change that requires a small amount of work from my part and a small amount of iterations, that's going to be pretty fast. If it's something fundamental, something that maybe, I don't know, changes the core mechanics of the game, that's obviously going to be a lengthy process. But that's the whole point of the live ops monitoring. Changes are included in that, right? So we expect that there will be regular updates and we will constantly be running through different scenarios whenever a new update comes out and make sure that it does not hinder the economy in any way.
Perfect. No, the questions are coming in fast. Actually, I'm going to pass this one. I think it's a nice question over to Heimdall and Fleet Commander. Where do you see the project 3 months after launch?
Sure. Well, 3 months after launch is, relatively quick, but also, a good amount of time frame. I mean, considering development in this project has, come together in maybe under 5-ish months, that's, over half the time it took to do everything here, which is a lot of infrastructure and foundation, which requires, significant work. The game development stuff is the easiest, actually, at least in the game, as obviously all the game contracts were finished in December. Since then has been audits, infrastructure, foundation, working with machinations and things like that, and doing our due diligence. So once we have that all set up, in which we're very close to doing, we'll be able to build a lot faster than like the other projects, and do more fun things, and iterate on new ideas quicker. So 3 months on the line, 90 days. I mean, be quite exciting. I mean, I know from our end, we'll likely have at that point introduced another ship class, maybe the exploration type ships, which will have an impact on regions or how the asteroid belt generation works, or maybe even new types of areas for players to go explore. I think that's plausible within 90 days. Likely, there'll probably be the ship rental system. There'll be the in-game marketplaces, maybe for some items and consumables. Rough things like this that we've already kind of built out the light structure for, but we'll likely be able to finalize the exact mechanics around and implement in the game. But with that said, that's maybe game side. That's just on our end. So if we have a decentralized project, who knows? Maybe other people start building in some small things. We'll see that into the game. Obviously, with the DAO, it'll be a process before it gets legs and starts moving smoothly. But the benefit is that we will still be here as the core team, building and working through it. So hopefully, within 3 months, we see a bit more of a refined DAO structure and a larger resource pool and understanding of how the community can use the DAO to its full advantage. And at that point, maybe in 3 months, we'll really start to see things take off from the community's end.
Nice. Actually, there is a kind of a follow-on question there, which I think you just touched on, which is, will there be a way to delegate our ships to external players for a share of mind ore?
Yeah, I think that was the rental question.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, we really definitely like the idea of a rental system where you, instead of just renting out for a flat price, it's more of a agreement that the renter gets a smaller percentage of the mind ore than the person renting the ship, and the player renting gets a large benefit. And what's nice about this is since this game kind of takes time and skill and mental effort to play. Obviously, whales can't prevent them. It's an open market. Who might have possibly 40 or 50 ships may really struggle to efficiently use their entire fleet, at which point it would be better, instead of just sitting on them, to rent them out to other players. And at that point, since it's a shared agreement, you'll likely have a very cheaper floor price in the rental cost, meaning new players or people who are not as capital flux will be able to enter the game ecosystem and start collecting ore and kind of getting used to things, and maybe even be able to contribute through the DAO and start that process and get more ingrained.
Perfect. Thank you. There's one here for another one for the fleet commander. Jimmy, the community manager, spoke about your view on smart contracts and gas wars. I'm aware that gas can be optimized, but could you speak on the approach of minting during gas wars?
I'll pass that off to Architect.
Sure. So a lot of it from our side has been optimizing the contracts to use as little gas at mint time as possible, because that's when we expect those real gas wars to happen. Of course, we're trying to avoid it with a sort of a reservation system, and we're more whitelist heavy than a lot of projects. But we do have a modified ERC 721 contract that uses a couple of tricks to try to bring gas down. You might be familiar with Azuki. Ours is we're not able to pull quite the same tricks as they did, because we have our bridging system, which means that the tokens minted are not, it's not one ID after the next, which is the core thing that they relied on. But we have used the tricks where we basically slow down the functions that people do not call from on-chain, where speed doesn't really matter, in order to optimize stuff like mints and transfers. So we should have cheaper transfers than Azuki, and relatively cheap mints in terms of gas, even if the price per gas is high.
Perfect.
I hope that was clear enough.
Hopefully that answered the question. It's a great answer. I think actually there's a couple of questions that all go around what happens if something goes wrong, Cesar? What happens if the economy does start to get out of shape? How does that kind of alerting process work?
Well, first of all, that will be the DevOps phase. We will have a look at all of the data that we receive. We're gonna put it through the models. We're gonna figure out the root cause of the problem, because usually in these types of situations, there's one component that could very well just be adjusted and it solves the whole. It's a mechanism, right? So if you fix one part of that mechanism, it's gonna run correctly. I imagine we're going to have like, this is a discussion a bit for the future. It's hard for me to predict right now, but I imagine we're going to have discussions around what should be fixed, right? There will be some proposals going back and forth, and we're going to see if the solutions work or not. That's going to be where we come in, right? Because it's easy for someone to have a solution. Okay, the economy is bad. What are we going to do? Let's just, I don't know, mint 500 chips instead of 300. Everyone can say that. Where we come in is we come in and say, okay, we're going to mint 500 chips in the models. Let's see what happens. Oh, that doesn't solve the issue. Let's think of it another way, right? So we're basically going to be testing a bunch of different scenarios until we bring the economy back to its course. But an important mention here to be made is that there are things that are in, let's say, the game's control and the player's control, and there are things that are outside of the player's control, right? The work that we are doing is for the game's economy and what is in the game's control, not outside factors that cannot be controlled or predicted in any way. So our mission is to ensure that the game's economy is healthy. That does not translate into outside factors working as we expect. And so.
Perfect. Another question, do you plan on opening new regions in the future if needed?
There's no concrete plans at the moment, you know, and when I say that, I mean, like, we have an exact region in mind with new variables and new mechanics. None of that exists, but the idea has been floated around, and we definitely really enjoy the idea of expanding the space and where players can go. One of my favorite ideas is using wormholes to kind of create a secondary map or multiple mini maps that is only accessible at, you know, through random points that spawn, much like belts. Wormholes may spawn and players can go through them and end up in, you know, in a random location on the other side and things like that. So there's nothing exact at the moment, but I think as the game grows and we flesh out further mechanics, it would make sense and be a fun way to expand, introduce new concepts as well, expanding, you know, the regions and introducing kind of new versions of those.
Right. Lots of questions coming in. I'm just trying to consolidate these down. There's a question here. Do you think there's going to be any way that the small fish can still be competitive in the game and not be swallowed by whales?
Yeah, definitely. One of my favorite things about this project, or the way the economy has been balanced, is much like there are many variables and there is luck involved, people who are likely more larger fleets will be playing more safely than others, and or maybe a bit more on the degenerate side and risking ships, meaning they might incur a lot more burns for their ships than other players, and players who take their time and play maybe safer because they have less ships can build up a large stockpile of ore over that period of time, meaning that maybe in the first few weeks of auctions, the people who have more ships will kind of burn out all of their ore and kind of reset themselves as they win them. And that'll allow a chance for players who are on the smaller side to kind of sneak into the auction, since the way it works, the blind reverse Dutch auction process for the lowest possible prices paid, meaning there's a way for them to climb through the ladder and really win there. Also, who knows, if you go to the abyss and you might get a 16 times, you know, ore pull, that's pretty huge compared to some other players. And so there's a lot of ways you can, you know, strategize what belts you pick and skill involved, where players who have a deeper understanding of the game and recognize patterns can likely outperform players who have more ships with a lesser understanding of the game. And add the ship rental system, and then there you go. Now there's a really cheaper way to get much more ships, and now you can use your strategies and knowledge in the game with 10 ships at the price of a fraction of what 10 ships would cost. Meaning, if you know how to play well, you can really push that to the limits.
Right. This question here: the initial supply is 3,333 ships, I think. What's the maximum supply within the development of the game? So,
Jaime, I think you could answer that.
Yeah.
Could you repeat the question? Sorry.
Would there ever be a maximum number of ships that you'd have?
Would there be a maximum number of ships eventually, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
I don't think it's entirely necessary, as you saw. I mean, we may, stop Genesis ships at some point. I'm not saying we won't. And obviously that'll be up to the DAO and all that. But as you saw with Cesar's models, you can see that eventually burnt ships will likely equal new ship supply. So it'll be kind of soft capped at some point, which is kind of what you want. You don't want to force the cap. I think a lot of P2E projects go wrong by forcing things to happen rather than letting the natural supply and demand decide what happens. And so we tried to, rather than set a hard mint cost for new ships or set a hard cap for things or set a hard cap for token supply, we created mechanics that allow for that to happen naturally. So everything's sort of soft capped in a sense, and it tends towards equilibrium. Just by creating mechanics that are kind of correct in their philosophy behind the way they affect the game economy. So I think most people or most of these projects that have a difficult time look at things kind of on like a surface level, where they just kind of come up with some numbers and they see if it works, and then they increase the numbers if they don't work. Whereas you can never really catch up if you start with this kind of linear cost for things. And so the main driver of token burns actually in the economy is the auction house. And the reason why it works so good is because it allows burns to be dynamic and possibly percentage based, right? So every week we have a percentage based burn rather than a linear burn via like price cliffs or whatever. So you could have up to, you could have 30% of the supply get burned at the auction house. You could have 50%, you could have 70% of the token supply that's circulating. But we don't really know how that's going to work out, but we work based off averages to simulate the macro economy of the game. So I kind of went on a ramble there, but
yeah, no,
I think the goal is not to set hard caps, because then it doesn't act like a natural economy. It acts like some kind of a fake economy, basically.
Yeah, perfect. Look, we're coming up on time. I'd love to kind of hand it over to the Citadel team to kind of wrap us up and bring us home. Are there any kind of final words from Free Commander?
Well, for wrapping up on time, I hope everyone enjoyed the models and things like that. We can likely continue answering these questions on our own for people who are curious in voice chat after in the Discord. But I think that's all I have to say. I appreciate everyone coming, and definitely shout out to the Machinations team, Cesar and Matthew, and the rest of them as well. I cannot understate the value they have provided to the project, you guys as players, and the community as a whole. And the work they've done so far is honestly a drop in the bucket in the grand scheme of how the partnership and joint work together in the future will continue to, unfold. Truly an invaluable team to work alongside, and gives us more confidence than anything else in our project, especially Cesar. Cesar is definitely the man when it comes to these models. So
yeah. Well, we've really enjoyed the whole process, and we're really looking forward to seeing everything go live. I'll certainly be playing the game and having some fun with it, and continuing to work with you guys it's a pleasure. The whole approach you've taken to really make sure that you're creating a great game for your community and your dedication to, you know, making sure that it's going to be a great project and going the extra mile for it has just been really, really impressive. I think you guys set the gold standard of what a fantastic DAO project should look like and how it should be well run. So it's been an absolute pleasure, and we look forward to continuing it.
Definitely.
Excellent.
Sure.
Well, thank you very much. I'll make sure that all the questions we've answered as many as we can. We had a huge number of questions, and we'll make sure we share them all with you so you can take them to your Discord or wherever else it's going to make sense. But thank you very much, everybody, for coming and joining us today. It's been a great session.